Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Martial Mat, episode 17. And tonight we're going to be covering Spanish fencing and the influence upon other arts. And we have Mr. Tim Rivera on. And I'm looking forward to this from my ear and talk to several folks. I've had him on the FMA discussion before. It was Molly Powell, a fielder gentleman. It was an excellent show. Yeah, extremely knowledgeable. Looking forward to it. So if you have questions, put them on the right-hand side. If they are not within the context we're discussing, I'll definitely jot them down and get to them, but I won't interrupt the flow of the conversation. So that's all. But please put them in there. And if you're watching, tell us where you're watching from and smash that like button. Without further ado, here he is. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for coming on.
No problem.
So Spanish fencing. So what? Because I know, like I mentioned, I had you on before, but I'm trying to like, what got you involved in Spanish fencing?
Well, Filipino martial arts, honestly. I
Through
started with
that, okay.
Filipino martial arts, yeah, and you hear the stories about fencing influencing it, and so from there I started looking into it. Um, I started probably in the, I started Olympic fencing in the late '90s, and did that for a while, but I didn't really get into heavily into the Spanish fencing until 2008. That's when I started doing transcriptions and translations and those things.
So, what Filipino martial art were you taking that drove you to Spanish fencing?
Well, my original art was Inosanto Kali. That's what I started with, and from there I kind of branched out to a bunch of different ones, looking at a variety of things. And the one that I landed on in 2001 was Coremorarnis, and that's what I've been doing. Other than looking at, I'm still constantly always looking into other arts, but
Yeah,
very
yeah,
much
yeah.
my
Yeah.
main art.
So, um, well, I guess what was the inspiration to uh, pursue Spanish fencing? Like, did you want to get more clarity into the influence on FMA? Because you kept hearing about the Spanish influence on FMA.
Yeah, that was the initial push. I wanted to learn more about it, and in the late '90s, early 2000s, there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, there was. It was available. There was information online. You could find it, but it wasn't very complete. And then in 2008, I think, or 2007, one of those times, there was I saw that an older manuscript had been found of an older style, and so I wanted to look into that and found that not much had been done with it. So since I wanted the information, I just started transcribing it and started translating it, and from there, I just kind of, I don't know, I liked it, so I stuck around and kept doing it.
So, what was there a particular style you sought, or
What do you mean?
like far like as far as the Spanish fencing, like was it just overall Spanish fencing, or did you end up finding like a specific style that you started researching?
Yeah. So the I didn't start. I started just looking overall, but I kind of settled into a particular area. So it would probably help everybody to uh, if I talked about what Spanish fencing is. That would frame a lot of the conversation. So when most people think, or I guess to start off, Spanish fencing doesn't exist. It's dead. It died out. So all we have are historical treatises and manuals and things in order to try and understand what it is. So most people, when they think about fencing, you think of what we call modern fencing or Olympic style, modern Olympic fencing. which is what you see in the Olympics. Um, then there's also classical fencing, which uh, that so modern fencing doesn't really have there are styles of modern fencing, but they're not as varied as they used to be because it's part of a sport now, so you're trying to optimize it for the sport. When you look at classical fencing, that is something that still exists today, but is a distinct branch from modern fencing. So modern fencing kind of broke off from the classical fencing, and so you'll have like classical Italian fencing, classical French fencing. Those are the big ones that are still around, but they're not nearly as popular as modern fencing. Then you have historical fencing, which is fencing that died out and no longer exists, either because it evolved into like in the case of the Italians, it evolved into classical Italian fencing. So their historical Italian fencing doesn't exist anymore, but they have treatises and manuals where you can see what it was and see how it evolved over time. So there is no classical Spanish fencing. There's no modern Spanish style. It's all historical. It died out in, depending on how you count it, the late late 19th century. You could say it was gone, and there were actually Spaniards who were trying to bring it back in the late 19th century and recreate it like we're doing now, and that didn't work out very well. And there was even a more modern fencer who wanted to try to create a Spanish style. And that was like right around the end. It was about the turn of the 20th century, so early 1900s. And he was attempting to do it by taking what he felt was the best of French fencing and the best of Italian fencing and combining them together in order to create a uniquely Spanish style. Um, but that's not really a Spanish fencing, although and it didn't really take off.
Now,
It
was this a geographical thing? Like, is there like is it north, south, or like middle kind of like thing, or was it like in general when it comes to
for
like
for which
for Spanish fencing?
yeah. So Spanish fencing is it's more accurate to say Iberian fencing.
Yeah.
Iberia being Spain and Portugal, so the whole peninsula that they're on is the Iberian Peninsula,
Hmm.
and their fencing styles were interrelated. There are a few differences, but they're not really noteworthy. They don't follow the kingdom boundaries or anything. There's a lot of back and forth and across. So there's bigger differences over time than there are geographically between those two. And in certain periods of time, there are certain, um, I guess, factions that had slightly different styles where they would be different. But again, most of the time, over time, is the real difference between styles as opposed to geographic differences. But there are a few that that did exist.
Like, have you are you in contact with any of the like fencing or HEMA
That
style guys
you say died
from
out.
Spain?
Yes, yeah. So so Spanish fencing is a part of HEMA. So HEMA being historical European, so it just kind of is a very broad umbrella,
Hmm.
and so it is considered a part of HEMA or a HEMA style. Most people think of HEMA as like longsword fencing, um, but it is in there, and I do have contact with various groups in Spain and various fencers from there that also work on this stuff. So
Which groups are you in contact with?
the main one is uh, from the northwestern part of Spain. Is AGEA. It's the Gallegan Association of Historical Fencing. Uh,
Hmm.
that's headed by Manuel Valle and also a few others, Denise Cabrera and Tompoy. Also, Tompoy's got his own school, which is the Academia de Espada.
Hmm.
They're also up in Santiago and that northwestern area. I have had contact with the other biggest group is probably the AEEA, which is the Spanish Historical Fencing Association, and that is they're all over Spain, but I think their headquarters is in Madrid, and that's headed by Alberto Pompresi.
Is that
Um,
the Sociedad de Guerreros?
no, no, that's a different group.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't contacted or I haven't had any contact with that group. Um, but it's uh, it's a pretty small community. The not very many people, uh, not very many people practice or research Spanish fencing. Um, so I may have run across them uh, and just not known it because most of the time people don't really identify themselves as the group so much as the person because it's so small.
And sorry, I'm late. As a Spaniard, I'm always late. So just letting you know.
So Tim, this is Renee. Renee, this is
Yeah, actually just got home from work like 5 minutes before I logged on, so I was
Oh,
almost
nice.
late as well. Yeah.
Well, Dean told me to show up by 7:15, and I was like, normally we're at 7 o'clock, but all right. And
so. I mean,
Well, you can make an entrance, I guess.
it's always. But, so I mean, there you go, the entrance. So where do you see it? Like you're trying to, what they excel that in late 1900s, and early 20th century. You try back going through the artifacts, manuscripts, etc.
I didn't catch it. It was breaking up for me.
yeah, Dean, we're running into the same issue as before.
Yeah, I don't know. You heard me though, right, Renee? What is going?
Try opening your blinds.
Hear me? Or no? You guys are not here.
Barely.
Yeah, it's breaking up.
I have no idea what's going on. Let's see here. Messenger. This is.
Okay, well, I can go ahead and start talking, I guess, until we get this worked out.
Speak
So
about.
another thing to, I guess, set the stage is when it comes to talking about Spanish fencing, there's a wide range of time that it exists in. And so, like I said, it kind of died out late 19th century, but goes all the way back to the oldest that we still have. We have records of fencing examinations from back in 15th century or even earlier than that. But the oldest treatises that we still have, we know about some from the 15th century. We just haven't been located yet. Um, but the oldest ones we have go back to the 16th century. So it's about 400 years or so of Spanish fencing, and hopefully people can still hear me. Anyway, uh, the I, I tend to break Spanish fencing into three kind of broad categories that exist over time, and the first being the traditional Spanish fencing that existed as far back as we know, as we can find. And then in the late 16th century, there was a change. So this was right around the start of the scientific revolution, and there was one nobleman who didn't like the way fencing was, and wanted to turn it into a science, or what they understood to be a science at the time. And so that started around that time, and then in the 17th century, that's when it started to take hold. And that is destreza. So that when most people talk about Spanish fencing, or when they say, destreza, or destreza is Spanish fencing, that's usually what they're talking about. So that's kind of this middle period style that is typically thought of as Spanish. And these two different types kind of coexisted for a while, not very peacefully. The newer style, the Destreza authors were very disparaging towards the old style. They would call it common, or they would also call it vulgar, because it wasn't proper, it wasn't refined like a science, like it should be, like they wanted it to be. And so that the Destreza style took over, more so in Spain than Portugal, but it also did exist in Portugal. It just took more root in Spain for political reasons. And then the later style, uh, that came in about the mid to late 18th century, and then especially into the 19th century. That's when it really started to take over, and that's when Destreza died off. And that later style was an import of um, French and Italian styles of fencing. So they came in, again, for political reasons. The French fencing got very popular, and initially it blended in with Destreza, and so you had these kind of hybrid styles, and there you would have some that were purely French, and then slowly the Destreza kind of fell away, and just partial elements of it were left, until it finally was gone. So
So were they? Sorry to interrupt, but were they? Were they following like a certain manuscript or anything, or was it?
yeah. So um, the old style, the traditional style, we only have actually one complete manuscript of that style, although we have some references to it, and that one was more, um, like I say, like traditional, so it was more passed on in person. When the Destreza came around, there were a few influential authors, but there were a lot of authors. There were a whole lot of books written on this, and it was, um, because of the nature of the style and the way that they presented it, that didn't even necessarily need to be passed on in person. So there were a lot of people who would just learn through a book, and would develop their fencing that way, in that style. And but they did have schools, they did pass it on. There was teaching that happened, but um, some of, especially the influential authors, would talk about how you don't necessarily have to perform the art, or you don't necessarily have to teach. Even once you get to the title of maestro, you become certified as a maestro. That didn't obligate you to teach. You could, write a book, and you could display all of your knowledge and all of these things, but you weren't necessarily obligated to teach. And that had to do with their idea of what a gentleman was. And so any sort of, like, if you go back to the scholastic European idea of liberal arts, so there's 7 liberal arts. There are also 7 mechanical or servile arts, which are more like labor. So it's almost like a blue collar, white collar thing. where if a proper Spanish gentleman isn't out there exerting himself and doing physical things. So that's part of the culture around it, and so there were in-person training and teaching and things like that, depending on who it was, but it did persist. But then there were also interconnections that just happened through these writings, where one author would reference another author, or um, one of the most famous, I guess, most popular authors for this reza is Luis Pacheco de Narvaez. So he was so popular because of, again, political reasons, that he was often referred to by later authors as our author or our master. And so he was the one who was typically um, probably the most esteemed, I guess, other than a man by the name of Carranza, Jeronimo Sanchez de Carranza. He was the inventor of it, but he didn't leave a technical treatise on how it should go. His treatise was very philosophical. It was written as a Socratic dialogue between friends discussing fencing. So um, Pacheco was the first to step in and actually give technical definitions to things, and so he's kind of the father of it, depending on how you want to look at it. Um, and then once the later styles came in, there were various French authors that were very influential. Um, I couldn't tell you their names offhand because they're French, and I don't really care too much about French. Um, but I could look them up and find them for you.
No offense to any French people that are watching.
No, no, it's just not me. I don't really speak. I don't speak French. I don't really read modern French. Older French is much easier because it's much closer to Spanish. But the newer French is not me.
Sorry, like, so where are you actually located?
I'm in St. Louis, Missouri.
Messages.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And like, do you have like a YouTube channel as well and stuff? Like,
I do, but it's not very active. I don't think I've put anything on there in like 10 years or something. The only videos that I put on there were just to help out some people with some interpretations of some of these videos, but I don't have anything instructional or um,
I,
or
I'm
a lot of
yeah,
videos at all.
I'm laughing because I literally have one that's been active for like 20 years, and I post something like every 8 months. So,
Yeah, I'm
so,
awful about that stuff.
so when it comes to your like references that you speak about, like from Spain, like do you have people in Spain that you've trained with, or do you converse with, or how's that work?
Yeah, so most of what I do is academic. Um, so it's very like I have trained with people from Spain. When they are over here, but I generally don't. My focus is not so much on the performance of the art, but more on the research and attempting to get this information into English, because there's a whole lot of information that's out there um, in Spanish, but a lot of people just can't read it. Even native Spanish speakers, because it's books that are hundreds of years old, and words have changed and meanings have changed. So sometimes it's hard to understand, and then particularly with the destreza, because they they wanted to. Um, as they were creating this as a science, they wanted to try to put it together with other sciences. So they sciences or philosophy. So they would put it with like philosophy and geometry and theology and music, and they tried to just marry everything together, and Aristotelian physics and Aristotelian philosophy. So um, even being able to understand the language isn't enough to understand what they're actually talking about, because a lot of times they'll use um, they'll use words that are technical vocabulary, but you don't know what it is that they're actually talking about, because it's a reference to some other philosophical where they talk a lot about geometry, and if you don't have a good grasp on geometry, you can get lost on what it is that they're actually trying to say.
It's funny. Like for me, the fascination with Spanish bladed arts, uh, it almost like for me it translates to Filipino arts because the marriage of Filipino arts and Spanish arts, because there's definitely an influence, right? So for me, it's um, I was like that was part of the history that I'm really interested in as well, because when 99% of the terminology that I hear in Filipino martial arts
Oh,
are Spanish words. So
I,
um,
I'm sorry, it
oh,
blanked out for me. I couldn't hear what you said.
I
You
said for me
marriage and
the
it blanked out. I didn't hear.
the the big thing for me, like as a stick fighter sort of thing, is as a Spaniard, I love to learn the crossover between Filipino and Spanish arts because I see it, and also like a lot of the strikes and everything else are Spanish words, right? So it's like I hear abanico or oh, there we go.
Can you
Thanks,
hear
D.
me now? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I don't know what is going on. I sent you uh, a message. Yeah, I don't know. I know. Okay, he's back. Let's get him back in. Oh, technology.
If you keep me in the
Ah,
center, I should be
okay.
okay.
He's frozen. I don't think that's us. Oh, he's back. Ray, you're hearing me okay, right?
I can
I
hear
can
you.
hear you now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. All right. Sounds like we're all in sync. Okay. So, Renee, yeah, you were at. Go ahead.
So what I was saying is my big thing for me is just because I hear it all the time, but like the influence of Spanish arts, especially with bladed arts, how they bled into the Filipino culture and how they became part of their system, sort of thing, right? So
Hmm.
that's what I was saying before, and it's always funny when I hear someone saying abanico or anything else, and it's like these are all Spanish terms. I'm curious how that all kind of happened. Obviously, because we were there for a few hundred years and everything else. But I'm wondering if you have any insight on that.
Yeah. So the it's actually really interesting, because all of the, or nearly all of the Spanish terms in Filipino martial arts don't exist in Spanish fencing, um, and that's always been a kind of a curiosity, because they are Spanish terms. So why are they using them?
Mhm.
Um, I've had some theories, and if anybody's been courageous enough to wade into Andrea Rollo's thesis that's out now, it's like 1,200 pages long, so it's pretty deep. But he's got some information in there about what he's found as far as where those terms have come from, and so they. Uh, They do come from Spanish influence, but they don't come from necessarily Spanish fencing influence. So the his thesis is about the Moro and the influence of Moro. And so for part of his uh, is that the that terminology came from the Moro, and so they would use these terms or a lot of these terms, even though they're um, they're not part of Spanish fencing, but they were, or at least a lot of them were, a part of the Moro plays or Moro dances or celebrations, however they manifest in whatever area. Um, but that's yeah, that's one of the big traps that a lot of people have is
Mm.
they hear Spanish terms and they think, oh well, there's Spanish influence, which is correct, but they automatically jump to Spanish fencing influence because if you think bladed arts of the Philippines must be related to bladed arts of Spain, and it's not necessarily the case.
Was there, but while not necessarily the case though, but is there some crossover to what we're presently seeing in FMA today?
There could be, yeah. The biggest indicator, I think, or the most direct crossover, probably, um, is the numbering of striking angles or cutting angles. So that's it's not terribly common to number cuts or strikes.
Mm.
Um, but it's pretty common in Filipino martial arts, and it is also used in later Spanish fencing, which with the saber. So there's a lot of saber cutting angles with the saber that are numbered, and the interesting part about that is if you look at the Spanish fencing and talking about the influence of Spanish fencing, if a lot of it came later, it may have come through Spain or come through Spaniards. But that doesn't necessarily, well, depending on how you want to look at it, to me, that doesn't make it Spanish fencing because the cutting, the numbering of cuts and sabers, the Spanish actually got that from other Europeans. Even the whole weapon, the saber, that got imported from other Europeans. Like they didn't really, it doesn't really show up in fencing treatises until the very late 18th century or early 19th century, and it's an imported weapon. It's not something that they used. So when the weapon
So
came along, the styles of using it came along with it. And so like the earliest that people have found recording of the numbering of cuts is actually English. It's not Spanish, and but it quickly got adopted elsewhere because it's uh, it's a pretty handy thing when you're teaching a lot of people or you're teaching recruits and you're not really teaching them in depth kind of things. It's easy to just say cut one, cut two, cut three, cut four, and it began with cavalry fencing. So you don't need, with cavalry saber, you don't really need a whole lot of in-depth back and forth, because you're on a horse fighting either somebody who's on the ground, so you're cutting at the people on the ground, or you're fighting somebody else who's on a horse. So there's a lot of passing. So you'll have, a chance to hit, maybe parry, and then hit back, and then they may be behind you, and you need to turn and cut behind you. So it's very different than fencing on foot. Um, so you can look at things like that and say, okay, the cutting in Filipino martial arts being numbered, that may go back to Spanish fencing. It also might go back to American fencing because um, American saber also had numbered cuts. So um, without knowing, okay, pre 20th century, whether or not they had numberings in their cuts, or whether that kind of crept in at the beginning of the 20th century. That would be when the Americans were there. So, that could have just as easily come from Americans instead of coming from Spaniards, but it's the same idea, still from saber fencing. Um,
Mm. Huh.
so that's the biggest one probably. There's a few others that are just like here and there, but on the whole, there's really not a lot of technical overlap between the two, and um,
Wow, because
so
I'm
it's
telling you, everybody thinks that. You know what I mean? Like that
right,
great
right.
influence. And what about so number? Okay, so numerically speaking, far as counts and etc. But what about the whole? So when the Spanish were fighting, over there, and I mean, was there cooperation? Far as were they teaching the Filipinos?
So yeah, that's another thing. There weren't a lot of Filipinos or sorry, there weren't a lot of Spaniards in the Philippines, and most of the people who were actually doing the fighting were the Filipinos because that's the way the Spanish did things. Um, so there's a lot of supposition, especially militarily, especially when you look at, oh well, the basics are numbered cuts, and those came from saber, and saber is a military weapon, so they must have learned it in the military, and so forth. That is possible, but the thing to think about is that didn't occur until the uh, 19th century, mid to late 19th century. Even if there were Spaniards that were taking Filipinos into their army, or their whatever their troops were, there was no standardized military instruction of sword fighting until the 19th century,
Mm.
until mid 19th century ish. It just didn't happen. It wasn't really something that was you didn't necessarily want your troops running out there and fighting with swords. Grab a spear, go fight with a spear. It's way more effective in combat um, than a sword is, and especially when you start talking, 18th century, 19th century, guns became much more prominent, and then um, even spears started to fall out as
Right.
bayonets became better. So um, swords were. Um, from a European perspective, anyway, swords were always much more of a sidearm, and or for personal protection, or for just sport or dueling. Much more focused on one-on-one combat as opposed
But
to.
it wasn't
Uh,
nobility, nobility and status, maybe, or no?
yeah, yeah. The swords, yes, they were much more. Um, it's it's kind of related. So it's not really a weapon of war. It's more of a weapon of status or of personal protection. But so you would find people who would do that. So even when it came to uh, instruction of troops, because we know it did happen. Um, the first one that I can find is about mid 18th century. It's also the um, first book that was published in Spain that was a non-Spanish method in hundreds of years. It was a French method. So the person who was writing it was an instructor at the Naval Academy, and so he was teaching how to use the small sword, which is again it's a later import into the country. It wasn't native; they got it from the French. He was teaching officers how to use the small sword. So instruction in how to fight with a sword um, started either with officers or with cavalry. But when we think of like fencing as opposed to just basic, cuts and parries, it was really more about officers. And he does mention that he does put a little bit of saber in there, and he says that you're not really you're probably not going to need it, but he says that he's found it useful to know. And really, the only people that need to fight with sabers or cutlasses would be Marines. So I think Robert Small mentioned Filipinos on Spanish ships. So yeah, the use of a sword on ships is going to be more common. It's going to be a shorter sword, what we commonly call a cutlass. But even that is still much later in history. So that's going to be 19th century. And there wasn't just swords that they used. They had axes, pikes, different types of weapons for whenever there was ship to ship combat. Um,
Mm,
but there wasn't any organized, mandated standard training for the military um, until, like I said, the 19th century. So it did start more with officers, which would have been nobility or more important people, minor nobility, with regard to the military side of fencing.
okay. Okay. So I guess I mean this opens up like a whole gambit, like from what we've been told or what we have thought, just based on information being handed down to us, regardless of the instructor system. Um, so I guess if there wasn't a direct, I mean, besides the numbering sequences and all that, so was there? So did the Filipinos just had their own kind of methodology, or was it mostly, as you said, initially spears and all that before they even went to an edge weapon?
So militarily, yeah, it would be spears. But from other points of view, yeah, the sword was around. We know the sword was around, but we don't know much about um, how how fighting went. Speaking specifically with Filipinos, how fighting went before, um, basically before the latter part or before the Spanish got there. So we're not sure what they did with their swords, but presumably they had a method of fighting with swords, even if it was informal. Um, depending on how you define like martial arts or fencing or whatever, they probably had something. We don't know. There's no record of it that anybody's found. But it would be kind of weird for them to have swords and then just not know how to use them. Um, One of the big differences and why I say that, other than terminology wise, why I say that there's not much technical influence, if any, between or from Spanish fencing to Filipino martial arts, is that the swords are very different. Um, so they require very different methods of use. There's a later author, Morello. I can't remember which one of the Morellos it is. Probably Jaime. He's probably the one who wrote the most. But he was like mid 19th century, and he was taught. He had a treatise on, I think, saber, um, and he talked about smaller weapons, and he listed various different smaller weapons, and some of them being, I think he talked about Chris and something else. There were a couple Filipino weapons that were listed in there, um, and how to fight against them. And then he talks about how to fight with them, and his reasoning for how to fight with them is all derived from his fencing method. But it is quite distinct from his fencing method. There's a lot of stuff that just doesn't work because because the blade is so short, and then two, because there just isn't much hand protection. And um, Spanish fencing really relies on hand protection and blade length in order to function the way that it does. And as soon as you take
Mm,
both of those away, um, it doesn't work as well as it should. So there may have been ideas that were taken and adopted, but most likely, it's like looking at somebody fighting with an axe and then saying, "Oh, I'm gonna take that axe fighting and apply it to my sword."
Right,
It's
right.
it's a completely different weapon, even though they're both called swords, because they both just have a fairly long blade with a grip on one end. But the way that they're used optimally is very, very different.
Do you think it's possible that the Moro is this why maybe the Spanish had, I guess, problems with the Moros, or maybe the sword influence on the mainlands was from Moros?
I mean, it's possible. Um, the Philippines has always been. Are you talking about the Philippines, or are you talking about Spain?
The Philippines, like
Okay,
if we know for sure, like the Spanish swords definitely had to be, they had to be definitely maneuvered. I mean, a different way of moving them and et cetera than the
right.
Filipino swords. So if they were influenced by Spanish, is it possible maybe it was from the Moros and
I,
maybe?
it is possible, but one of the things to really keep in mind when thinking about Filipino Filipinos in general before the Spanish, before they were really Filipinos, right? They were all these different groups that lived in different areas, and they weren't uh, culturally they weren't homogenous. It wasn't just this is the Filipinos,
Mm,
uh, and it wasn't just they were all Moros, and then the Spanish came over. So there
right.
were a lot of different groups that did things a lot of different ways, and um, so it's very difficult to say um, whether they had a similar way of doing things or whether they even had a way of doing things that was very formalized. So it's the Philippines is very cosmopolitan when it comes to, like, we like to say America's a melting pot, but really the Philippines is way more of a melting pot than America is. You've got the influence of the Malays down to the south, and then
Mm,
you've got Southeast Asia right there, and China's right there, and then
right.
you've got Japan right up over there, and that's just their neighbors, basically.
Yeah.
Uh, so there was a lot of trade going on, a lot of
Trade. Right. Right. Right.
ideas being gone back and forth. So it's very difficult to say, take a modern grouping of people and say that they historically were the influence of this. People can speculate, and there's nothing wrong with speculation as long as people say, yeah, I'm just speculating.
Mm,
But with regard to the Spanish, because we have so much historical documentation of the way that they fenced, going all the way back to the 16th, even 15th century, we have a pretty good idea of the way that they did things. And so we don't have that kind of thing for the
right.
Philippines.
Right. Yeah, I know. Um, so here, I guess, one of the things that, as far as weapon configurations, the infamous Espada Daga. I mean, everybody says, oh, definitely the Spanish influence. I mean, so was that something that was later derived from Spanish from the Philippines?
So my thought on it, um, or my theory on it, I guess, is that has always been that came from the Moro, right? That's what a lot of people say. That's what a lot of things are. I didn't have a lot to back up. It's just things that were said. Oral history of
Mm,
Filipino martial arts and things like that. And it, from a technical point of view, sword and dagger fighting, espada y daga in the Philippines, and espada y daga in throughout history in Spain were technically very different. Mostly because the sword was very different, so their primary weapon was used in a different way. So that backup weapon would also influence how that was incorporated. Like um, they're not going to completely change the way that they fight by having a dagger in the other hand. It's going to be an addition in order to help things out. Um, but the fact that it is sword and dagger is is unusual, and and calling it espadiadaga also, and that sort of thing indicates there's some sort of influence from Spain, because sword and dagger was very common in Spanish fencing until the later part. Actually, there's an
Mm,
account from the early 20th century where there's a fencer. Um, is a European fencer. He's he's uh, he's Filipino, but he is a fencer in a European style. Um, so he talks about how a lot of people commonly believe that sword and dagger wasn't European fencing. That it had, at that point, it had fallen off, because historically sword and dagger was very important, but later on in Spanish fencing, it was just the sword by itself. Once the small sword came in, so a regular sword is going to be about the length of the blade will be about 41 inches, or I think that's like 105 centimeters, something like that for non-Americans. Um, so it's a pretty long sword. Um, and then the small sword, when it came in, was shorter, so it would be um, up to maybe like 3 feet long, um,
mm,
or even less than that. And the blade was much thinner, and the hand protection was much smaller. So that they call it a small sword, or in Spanish they call it espadín, which just espada is sword, espadín is a small sword. Um, so with that, do the they didn't do small sword and dagger. Right, that wasn't a thing. They would do sword and dagger, and some of the later treatises would include the sword as well as the small sword.
mm,
And sometimes they would have the sword and the dagger together, but not the small sword and the dagger. So as the uniquely Spanish style kind of fell away, sword and dagger also fell away. So in the latter part, of the 19th century, the like mid to late 1800s, people didn't do sword and dagger at all. It was just sword or saber, and so people thought that sword and dagger didn't really wasn't Spanish fencing or wasn't European fencing until they went back to. If anybody went back and looked at some of the older books, they would see that that was there. So the fact that sword and dagger existed and persisted in the Philippines for so long is kind of, it's almost like an anachronism. It wasn't a later influence; it was an earlier influence on Filipino martial arts. But again, technically, they're very very different.
mm,
So my best guess was simply that it was an imitation. You know, either because they saw it and wanted to do it, or because in the Moro Moro, if they were playing the part of the Christians and they were telling a story of something that happened in Europe or whatever, if they were trying to be one of the historical kingdoms, or maybe they were recounting Charlemagne or whatever, they were portraying Europeans. So sword and dagger was the way that they would fight. But if they were supposed to use sword and dagger but weren't using a Spanish sword, they were using a native sword, then yeah, they could do sword and dagger, but it wasn't going to look the same and it wasn't going to work the same. So they'd get the idea of sword and dagger, but without technically copying the way that it works in Spanish fencing. It would be their own way. They would develop their own way of doing sword and dagger. So that was my theory. And interestingly, Andre Rollo did a lot of research on this, and a lot of that, and I don't want to get off on a tangent, but a lot of that has to do with the way that the Moro Moro developed and what it was. So his basic premise is that Filipino martial arts grew out of the Moro Moro, and
that's what that, I guess, yeah, and that's what to me makes sense because if the Spanish, if their methodology was just so different, different swords, different lengths, different size, different applications, like it would make sense. Well, Well, down below is probably where the influence or the copycat, so to speak, I
Right.
guess. Right?
Right. Yeah. So it's really, you could say, well, how it started really, we don't know. So it could be that maybe they did try to copycat it with different weapons and it didn't work and they developed their own, or maybe they didn't try to copy the techniques or the methods at all. They just
Mm.
decided to use that um, modality of weapons, the sword and the dagger, but they used their own swords and their own daggers, and then said, "Well, how are we going to do this? How
How
do
to
we fight with
incorporate
this?"
and
Right.
from a
And so a lot of
methodology,
that's just
right?
kind of a cultural thing where that was a part of, for instance, the Moro is you're going to fight with a sword and a dagger because that's what you're doing here in the Moro. So you're going to develop a way to fight with the sword and dagger. Um, so it uh, it is definitely, or seems to be, a cultural influence from Spain, whether or not there was any kind of technical um, influence that was involved. So
But it would be
that's
tough to beat a technical influence, as you point out, because the weapons were just so much different as far as length and
right,
size.
right. And
Whereas the
I mean, you
morals,
can try, but
okay.
oh, go ahead.
No, I mean the more, where the maybe the moral weapons were more in line, depending on what they copycat, as far as the blacksmith are concerned, and maybe they made something along more lines. I mean, against or my speculating like you.
Yeah, but I mean, the non-moral Filipinos before the Spanish got there had their own types of blades and their own, each group had the way that they made blades. There were, um, I'm not a bladesmith. I don't research how blades are made or pandais, so it's better to talk to somebody else about that. But from what I've heard from people, there were influences on the way that blades were made in parts of the Philippines based on the Spaniards coming over and their blades. So that did influence how those were made. But even before then, there were distinctions between um, what we think of today as the Moros and their culture and their blades and the way that those were used, and then also um, probably the way that they were used because we don't know, but we know what the blades were. We have an idea of that the blades were actually different um, in other parts of the Philippines. So they didn't like the most iconic kind of moral blades. You're talking about like Chris and Campilan and Barong. Like those are the
Mm.
three that everybody knows. Um, those weren't really copied in the Moro, right? They even if so, sometimes they would be used for the side that were portraying the Moros, but the Moro wasn't necessarily, the stories in there weren't necessarily about Filipino Christians against Filipino Muslims, right? Because the term Moro just means Moor, which is a term that was originally about North African um, Muslims, and so that term just got transplanted to the Muslims that were in the Philippines, and so
Mm.
uh, when you're talking about Moro, what it really is about the struggle between Christians and Muslims. But a lot of the stories and things come from the stories of Europe and their struggle between
With it with North
Christians and
Africa and
Muslims.
etc.
Right, right.
Gotcha, gotcha.
So even within the Moro, if you're trying to portray, a story that comes from Europe, you're not going to be trying to use um, uh, you're not going to be trying to use Filipino weapons for the Moros necessarily. So it's a lot of this covers a lot of time period and a lot of different things. So it's very very fluid, and there's not really any one single answer or a good answer
I'm looking,
or anything.
spoken to, Rolo a bit, and he's eventually going to come on once he gets his project done. But I'm sure it's going to be fascinating what he's uncovered. As far as
Yeah, he's got some great stuff in there.
yeah, I mean, it seems pretty extensive in the time that he's allotted for that. So, all right, so we're going to conclude that FMA arts are all imitations of everything else. No, just I'm going to be real popular in any moment now. No,
Right.
I'm just catching up on the comments here. Let me just see here. I mean, this is it's fascinating, though. Like again, we were. I mean, in no fault of anybody. You know what I mean? What was around for resources at the time and what was shared, verbally and that. I mean, but I guess to put it, I mean, a lot of us were just handed a bag of goods, right? I mean,
Right. No,
not intentionally.
I'm right, and I count myself among that group. I
Yeah,
also
yeah. I mean,
heard these stories, believed these stories, and that's why I
yeah.
got
I mean,
into this
it's,
this
it's,
kind of research so that I could see what Spanish fencing actually is.
right. Yeah. Which I mean, this is why I figured you'd be awesome to have on here. I'm just native system. Let me just post them here. Native systems would use what available, adapt, and certainly systems existed before the Spanish they adopted. Okay. I guess were they? I guess it would be the question of codification, right?
Hmm.
Um, are they, or they had something similar already,
Right.
um, which is always possible, right?
Yeah. Yeah. When we're speaking historically about this stuff, because there's no records, we all we can really do is speculate. You know.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I think it's going to be. I mean, pending on what role, but you're saying he was more, moral. Pending there, like I think it's going to be one of those things. Like we just may never know. Just due, like you said, due to the lack of documentation. We're not talking like manuscripts found over in Europe where it's
Right.
pretty explicit what was
Right.
going on.
Right. Yeah. So even Andre Rollo's thesis, he doesn't go much back farther than the middle of the 18th century. That's about as far back as he goes. And to answer Rich, yes, that's what we're talking about.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so he he does have a pretty persuasive argument about how the um, how the Filipino martial arts developed, and has a lot of sources for that. But again, nothing is
Concrete.
concrete.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
no smoking gun. So best you can do is present these things and then say, yeah, it was probably like this.
I'm looking forward to hearing like what he thinks, or what he's through his research. What he's comes up with, like as far as Filipino martial arts.
Yeah, I think it's going to surprise a lot of people or
Yeah, I kind of have
disappoint
an
a lot of people.
idea, just based on some talks and like right here, you can kind of surmise without making, an
Right.
absolute. But I think you're right. I think a lot of people are going to be very like, no way, no, it's all from here.
Right.
you but yeah, fascinating. So here's a question for you, not on topic. Like, what like I look at I understand the rolling machine, right? Okay, the shores all lined up, the gladius, center line push, archers before that, flanked by the cavalry and horseback, and whatever, demolishing the barbarians before they adopted their methods. What made the Spanish just so like overpowering from this not huge country?
Yeah, so that's pretty interesting, actually, because before this is like uh,
Oh my gosh, this has been nothing but technical difficulties tonight. My camera is also acting up. Well, he got him before, so hopefully he just got to maneuver something. I'm going to just reset my camera, and hopefully he'll be back soon. Lordy. There we go. All right. Yeah, oops, really, Tony. Um, Well, let's see if he comes back in. Yeah, the Spanish got him. Somebody got him. Don't reveal the success the Spanish had. Ah, there we go. All right. They were saying the Spanish guy. They did not want you to reveal their secret.
Yeah, the secrets. So I'll just start from the beginning because I don't know how much of that got cut. Um, the Spanish weren't always that great. It was probably about the around the end of the 15th century and into the beginning of the 16th century. There, they suffered militarily some defeats that caused them to go back to the drawing board. And there's a famous captain. They call him El Gran Capitan. Uh, I'm blanking on his name right now. Gonzalo. He reorganized the Spanish military, and so that's when we talk about historically. If you've ever heard the term pike and shot, that was what was really innovated by the Spanish, and how they came to dominate the different battlefields. So the Swiss had pike. They call them pike squares. It was just massive amounts of men in ranks and files who would have pikes, and they could do a lot of damage. Um, but the when pike and shot was kind of formulated, it was a distribution of pikemen and initially crossbowmen, but then eventually became firearms as those became more available and more prevalent. And then the tactics of how these fit together, how they interrelate, and how they went, and that's what allowed them to, on the battlefield around the 16th century, especially, but late 15th and early 16th century, and then on through their golden century, which was during the 16th and 17th century. They were militarily they were pretty dominant, um, and that also there were some political things. There was a great Spanish ruler that also ended up becoming the emperor of Holy Roman Empire, and so that all plays into it. But from a tactical military point of view, that was really the turning point. Was um, when they revamped and they developed the tercios and their pike and shot tactics, and so that's how they did well militarily, plus naval wise. When it comes to colonizing, and because they were kind of on top, uh, not really on top, but they were a major European power at the time of the age of exploration, and when everybody was going out and all of Europe was trying to colonize the rest of the world. They um, being good Catholics, along with the Portuguese being good Catholics, they ended up being able to, with the blessing of the Pope, kind of split the world in half with who got what. Um, so when they got to these other areas of the globe, their strategy was divide and conquer. So they would find either a group that was not necessarily in charge. Maybe they would find people who hated the people who were in charge if they were hated, or they would find a rival group or whatever. But
Mm,
they would try to, whether they were in the Americas or they were in the Philippines, they would try to pit the native groups against each other, and they would come out on top because they would help out a little bit because technologically they did have some pretty impressive armor and weapons and things like that. But they didn't just kind of roll in and submit everybody. They would make
mm,
make deals and alliances, and so basically they would bring the promise of power to these groups that didn't like these other groups, and so they would help them out a little bit. And then when those people would get on top, uh, they maybe rule their area, but then the Spaniards were on top of them, and so that was how they became so dominant during the colonial era, um, when they were out creating these colonies, especially in America, but also in the
So we're speaking
Philippines.
like, Mexico, Central America,
Right.
South America.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
all through the Americas, from Mexico down, and Mexico was always all the way up until
It
United
just always
States took it.
amazed me, like, and it's, I mean, what you're saying, it makes, because like I'm thinking, okay, so the ships are coming over. How, generally speaking, how many were on a ship?
Oh, I have no idea about that.
Okay. Because
Yeah,
I'm
I
just
couldn't say.
thinking, like, even if there were 5 ships that came over, I mean, you got to think of like all these natives, I mean, whoever was inhabiting the land at that time. Like, how are they taking over everything? But much
Right,
to the point, hey guys, we know you don't like what's going on over there with them. We'll, you know what I mean?
right, and especially because it wasn't like you know, noble, good Spaniards that were coming over and,
Hmm.
just on their horses with their shining armor, defeating everyone. A lot of the people that were coming to
Right.
the colonies were not really either well off or maybe decently moraled, I guess we should say. So they're either out there seeking their
Yeah.
adventure, or maybe they're fleeing from, the law or someone. So it wasn't always the best people that were coming over, and
Yeah.
so a
Right. They're
lot of
not,
people.
yeah, not, no, like moral code.
Right, right, like Cortez, that almost everybody knows, going into to Mexico. He was fleeing, um, the law, and like he was told to return, and he just ignored, and he just went over to Mexico and then just burned his ships and then just went. So that it wasn't like, the burning of his ships wasn't like, oh well, now these guys, have to fight or die, because it's a noble thing, and we're doing this for God and country. Like
Mm.
he was trying to get out of trouble, and so he was trying to run over and you know uh, conquer these natives through this divide and conquer um, strategy. And then if he could go and get a bunch of territory for Spain and get a bunch of gold for Spain, then he could come back and say, "Hey, look at all
Yeah,
this
look.
gold. Uh, Please forgive me."
Yeah, yeah. Remove the bounty, right?
Right, right. So it's a pretty ugly history. Um,
Wow. It is. I mean, but it's just fascinating, like how this happened. Like, I mean, when you look at Spain, I mean, like it was a machine,
yeah,
during that time. I mean, like,
yeah, it really was. And the great thing about it, or the funny thing about it to me, is it had absolutely nothing to do with their fencing.
yeah,
They're
well, yeah, because everybody says, "Oh, they must have been incredible swordsmen on the
right.
field," but yet, it just was manipulation. You know what I
Right,
mean?
right, and they didn't really want to fight with their swords on the field. Either the best thing to do is get somebody else to fight for you. So that's mostly what they did, and especially even in Europe, you'd hire mercenaries like the Swiss and some of the Germans. There was a lot of mercenaries there, or they would get Italians, because Italy wasn't united until much later. So it was various different types of Italians, and Spain was basically controlling southern Italy, and almost all the other European powers were fighting over Italy for hundreds of years. So you get Italians to fight for you, you'd get Swiss or German mercenaries to fight for you, um, or in the Americas, you'd get, or in the Philippines, you would get natives to do the fighting for you. If you couldn't do that, um, then like you definitely don't want to go riding in there with your sword fighting people. Like use guns, if you had that, or crossbows or something. Or if you had to get close, you want a spear, because you don't want to get in there and mix it up with other people with a sword.
Mm.
So there, for a really long time, until like I said, mid to late 19th century, their fencing was very civilian oriented. It was more about, even though dueling was illegal, it was more about one-on-one
As
fighting.
opposed to warfare, I got okay,
Right, right.
okay.
And then especially once Destreza came around, and it was more about science, philosophy, things like that. So Destreza is kind of the shortened name of it. It was actually the full name was La Verdadera Destreza, which means the true skill or the true destreza. So their idea was that they could use science to figure out this is the true way to do things. This is the good and proper way to do things, and all other types of fencing is false. So it wasn't concerned so much with effectiveness of fencing as it was trying to find this kind of divine truth of what fencing is, or what is the correct way to do things.
As opposed to giving it life again for combat and
Right.
going, yeah,
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 no, they were concerned with martial effectiveness, but that was not the primary concern.
not the primary concern. So
Right.
what they did as far as the new lands and there in the Americas, did they play the divide and conquer game with the Filipinos when they were over? Because like
Oh yeah.
you mentioned, like there weren't a lot of actual Spanish on the grounds there, right?
Right. Yeah. No, they had to do that. And partially it's because there weren't a lot of Spaniards there. And the reason there weren't a lot of Spaniards there was because Philippines is almost literally on the other side of the globe from Spain.
Right.
And there's no way to get there directly. So you would have to sail over to Mexico or somewhere in Central America. And then you would have to get to the other side of it over to the Pacific Ocean. And then you would have to sail from there over to the Philippines.
So that was no short trip.
No, no, and anybody who's really well to do doesn't want to do that. Why would you want to go to the other
Why
side?
would you want? Yeah, when you got all the luxury in your right.
Right, right. So the part of it is that part of it is there were some differences in policy, but it's why Spanish wasn't very widely spoken in the Philippines. Right? There were a lot of educated people in the Philippines who did speak Spanish, but it wasn't mandated like it was in the Americas. So you'll still have native languages in various parts of the Americas, but for the most part, the official language of everywhere from Mexico all the way down is Spanish, except for Brazil, obviously, is Portuguese. And then there's a few other that are a little bit different. But if you look at the Philippines, there's still like their mother tongue for the vast majority of them is like Tagalog or Cebuano or Ilocano or whatever their native
Mm,
language is there, or you would get like a Chabacano, which is Spanish Creole language that's there. So yeah, it's Spanish, but it's not really Spanish. But they again, it was part of it was policy, part of it was it's untenable. If they're trying to bring Catholicism and their culture to the Philippines, trying to teach everybody Spanish first when there's just not a lot of people there who know Spanish, and then try and teach them after that, it was much easier to just learn the native language and teach them these things in the native language. So, um, especially in the Philippines, there was a whole lot of um, you probably say exploiting the natives in order for Spain to get what they wanted out of the Philippines, um,
mm.
even more so than the Americas.
So you might have touched on this before, where we're having some tech issues. So did they get the Filipinos to fight for them in the new lands?
Yeah, absolutely.
So they on the ship heading over. I mean, voluntarily or kind of.
Uh, it probably was a mix. I don't know specifically with regarding the Filipinos, but I know a lot of times when they would take um, people from the Americas over to the Philippines, a lot of times they were criminals. They this was service that they had to do to kind of pay off their debt to society, so to speak. So sometimes they were conscripts, sometimes they were volunteers. It really just depended. It varied a lot, but it was very common. Yeah.
So it's not like they were, they train these guys, they made them these elite fighters, and then they brought them over there because, like you said, they didn't have a lot of people over there to. So training them and making them efficient for their type of
Right.
war, right?
Yeah. Most of the training, most military training, and this is even true. You know, to today. Most military training is not about getting your weapon and going out there and training to use your weapon, right?
Mm,
It's a lot of learning how to work together, how to live together, and how to
okay.
coordinate, and how to do things like that. So that kind of strict discipline didn't really enter into militaries until later on. So early on, there were a lot of mercenaries. There were a lot of um, uh, volunteers, that would want to go and do that. But uh, there was a lot of people would just come and go out of the army. It wasn't really terribly strict
Yeah.
until later, and they started to instill discipline, because the more discipline you had in your troops, the better off they could perform.
Yeah. It's what we were sold here, though, Dan. I mean, depending on who, if you went through the Anasano blend, you got a steady diet of this. So, just to be honest, without, again, I'm no fault to anybody. It's what the information was at the time that was handed down. So I certainly don't want to get that
Right. So, like
misconstrued.
I was saying earlier, the Philippines is very, very cosmopolitan. There's a whole
Yeah.
lot, and not just certain groups pushing the Spanish thing, but because the vocabulary, you get a lot of vocabulary in Spanish. So
Mm.
that's what naturally leads people to think, okay, well, what did the
Yeah, the
Spanish
Spanish are
have to do
right.
with this? Right.
Right. Just by mere association of like I mean, some of the terms, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah, because
yeah.
the names of the arts themselves, like eskrima, arnis, baston, estocada, like those, they're all garrote, they're all Spanish terms.
Mm.
So then it's hard to, or it's really easy to just say, well, obviously there's some connection from the
There's got to
Spanish.
be some, yeah, right,
Right.
100%, right. I guess how deep or whatever. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's interesting. I think, and when Rolo releases that, I think that's going to be really turning some heads.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people are really invested in the idea of either there is Spanish fencing and influence, and I'm going to find it, or the opposite, where they go, there's none. This is pure indigenous, no Spanish influence in my arnis, which is kind of
Mm,
silly because they'll call it arnis, or oh, I don't want to get off on that topic because I don't want to make anybody mad. But the when information like this comes out, there's a tendency to want to downplay it or want to ignore
oh,
it.
the subjective emotional attachment.
Right,
You know what I
right.
mean? But, because now they need to go back to their groups, their students. I mean, if depending on their integrity and honesty perspective.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's gonna make some people upset, but hopefully it'll kind of raise the dialogue, online, because a lot of
Yeah.
times uh, people will repeat things, and you know other information comes out, and people either don't hear it or don't want to hear it, and then the same thing happens. Somebody asks in an online forum or whatever a very honest question, and they'll get just old lines that people know, and they'll just be flooded with information that's not true, but
Yeah, they
people.
want to be the first one on the spot to answer, and so,
Right, right. And so
I've never seen that happen in FMA discussion.
right, so that's why things like
Um,
Andre Rollo's thesis, being out there, is going to be useful, because you can point to it and go, look, no, go read that, although nobody's going to read it. It's way too long. But also why my focus has been on trying to get as many things in Spanish fencing into English as I can, because the same problem exists online when it comes to that. There's a lot of speculation of what
mm,
Spanish fencing is without people actually knowing or having done any research on what it is. So it's not as bad. It's gotten a lot better over the years, but even just 10, 15 years ago, you would find people who were teaching Spanish fencing, which was really just Filipino martial arts with a rapier. They would take a Spanish
Really?
sword and they would go, okay, well, this is how espada y daga works in, the Filipino martial art that I studied. So I'm just going to do the same thing with my uh, replica Spanish sword and dagger, and then call that Spanish fencing. But that's dropped off a lot. The more
Oh,
people get
good.
into the
Okay. Okay.
research and things like that. But there's still a lot of misconceptions. So especially with destreza, there's a lot of because it's so oriented towards more educated people,
Mm.
and it can get pretty deep and complicated when it comes to geometry. So
It's
I think
cultural too. I mean, there's a cultural dynamic there. I mean, right?
right, right.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that you need to understand in order to. I'm going to see if this shows up well. So this is one of the more complicated diagrams that you'll find in a book. Um, so I don't know if there's too much glare.
Oh
There we
yeah.
go.
No, no, it's coming
That's
through.
better.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is like a footwork diagram that you'll find in a Destreza book. Like they're pretty complicated. This again.
Yeah.
This is an extreme example. This guy was extra.
So we're not just talking like a V step. No, just
Right.
kidding.
Right. So it's people will look at that and go, okay, you needed to be very educated to understand this,
Because of
which
the geometric influence, you're saying.
right, right.
Yeah.
You had to understand a lot of geometry, a lot of philosophy, and so there's the idea that this was only done by nobility or um, more educated people with leisure time, but that's not necessarily true. There is one book from the early 17th century where the guy talks about teaching farmers or field. He says men of the field, so it could be farmers, could be field hands, could be just whatever.
Mm.
Teaching them destreza, like, and he'd say we'd have to do our lessons at night because they're working during the day and then they show up at night, or they bring their sons at night, and I'll train them these things. So there's still a lot of misconceptions out there about Spanish fencing in general, and that all that stuff needs to be combated. But a lot of people don't like to um, hear these things. They don't like to be educated about these things. They haven't, like you said, an emotional investment in the way that things are.
Yeah, and pending their status in the community, that even makes it even more
Right.
difficult, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's very difficult sometimes to give contrary information that contrary to what a more valued or respected person in the community
Mm.
has given. And it's much more prevalent in Filipino martial arts, but the same thing also exists in Spanish fencing. Some people uh, kind of have their heroes or their preferred researchers or fencers, and it's like, well, so and so said this, and it's like, well, I can show you in the book right here where it says the opposite of that, and they don't want to hear it because they've already made up their mind about what it
I
is.
know. And then what it is the truth's not being let out. So therefore, their students or whatever they got going on, as far as lineage, they're not going to be exposed to it. And then the lies just keep, or the misconceptions just keep going and going and going.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah. Just making sure I'm not missing any questions here. Yeah, I mean, wow, fascinating. So your goal with all this is that you want to bring, like, are you trying to actually bring it back through the manuscripts and there and see if it'll catch on as far as interest?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a very private person. I don't like going on podcasts and doing interviews and putting myself out there. So I'm not the right person to take this information and champion it and bring it out
Mm,
there and show it to the world and everything. So I leave that to other people. There's plenty of other people that can do that. My goal is simply to make more information available, and so
mm,
I kind of find myself in the role of being a contrarian a lot of the times. Online, somebody will say a thing, and I'll say, how do you know that, or what's your source for that?
Good for
Because
you. Yeah.
sometimes I'm, missing things, and I want to know when I'm
Yeah.
missing it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have a
Oh,
source
yeah.
for that. Show me so I can get right.
Yeah.
Or somebody says a thing, and I go, well, that's not actually true, because of this and this and this, or that was only true in a specific area or at a specific time. And the answer is different if you look at different things, so you can't just generalize it to that one specific thing, which doesn't win me very many friends. And so I'm okay with that. I'm just gonna keep doing what I do and just putting it out there without trying to put
Yeah,
myself
it
out
can be
there.
tough. I mean, it could be like polarizing. I mean, depending like how you deal with that element in there, like FMA discussion. I can tell you, I've had my share of just you getting messages because you interview someone they said something or you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah. What
Whether it
you've
was
done is
accurate or
like
not. You know what I mean? It's I
that would be
can
a nightmare to me. What you've done, like put yourself
oh I
out
can't
there in
like
front of all these
oh, I
people.
can't tell you some of the stuff on the back end that has happened with me. That's why when people like they start complaining or this and that, I just tell them, just what have you done for the community? Well, then it's just a bunch of mumbo jumbo, and yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
And so that's my concern. Like I want these things to get out there. I want good information to be out there. I want people to have the opportunity to study these things if they do. There's a lot of moving parts to that, and so I leave some of those parts to people who are better. People who are better at organizing. People who are better at physically performing these things. People who are better at putting themselves out there online, getting
mhm,
information to people. Um, my niche, I guess, is primarily when it comes to Spanish fencing. My niche is taking things that are obscure in Spanish and bringing them into English, and then just giving them to people and saying, "Here, do whatever you want with this. I'm going to go find some more stuff." So I just kind of come out into the light once in a while and go, "Here's some new things," and then I just go hide back in my hole and start
But it
looking
sounds like
stuff.
you're doing the hard work. I mean, you're actually trying to transcribe this stuff so they can actually run with it. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
I mean, hard is relative. So,
yeah.
like I was saying, if I were to try and put myself out there, or produce content that people would like, and that to me that is hard. That is ridiculously
Mm,
difficult. Uh, Reading old books and then writing about them, or transcribing them or translating them, it's work, but it's not hard. It just takes time. So for me it's not difficult, and it's something I can do. So that's where I focus on
mm.
getting all that stuff out there, and letting other people run with it.
That's great. Well, I hope. I mean, I wish you success in there. What we gotta do is roll because I was thinking. Then we gotta bring you both on. let's just get this. Let's just get this out. And
Yeah, I mean, I would be up for that. Yeah, because it
yeah,
would
I
it would
think that
be
would be
good to
really
talk
fun.
to him. And
So what you gotta do is you gotta stay on him. Say, hey, look.
I have been in communication with him
Yeah. So Dean's
quite a
just
bit.
waiting. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do have some questions for him,
Yeah.
because I do agree a lot with his thesis, but there are some points that I don't necessarily agree with, or I think maybe he overstated a few things. But I'm very conservative about that type of making statements and assertions and those types of things. But um, yeah, I would enjoy that, because I'm I'm one of the few people that is going to read his thesis cover to cover. It's
So
not very many people are actually going to do that.
you'd be the
Uh,
perfect person to come on with him then. Yeah.
right, right. So hopefully, I'll have good questions for him, or be able to lead him in certain ways that, if somebody hasn't read it or has only read parts of it,
Mm.
uh, they may not be able to get the best kind of information out of him. So um, I have discussed that with him. I said, "Hey, I've got some questions and things for you as things pop up. I'm keeping notes and saying, all right, I got to discuss this. I got to discuss this." So, yeah, if other people would find that useful, then yeah,
I
I'd
think
be
it'd be
happy
great
to.
having you both. I mean, just when you next time you talk to him, say, "Look, I talked to Dean and was just on, and he said he would bring us both on." Yeah, I think that'd be fantastic. Like, how long is it again? What you got to read?
It's total. It's about 1,200 pages, but about 200 roughly of that is bibliography. So it's really about 1,000 pages.
Oh, still 1,000 pages though.
It's very comprehensive. It's very thorough.
Yeah, and he'll tell us, "Wow, that's gonna be." Yeah, he's gonna have to go in. He's gonna have to go in public hiding when he comes out.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, he's developed a lot of goodwill in the community just by releasing little snippets and
Yeah, he's been putting him in FMA discussion, and so
right.
every time I see his name, I mean, because usually his stuff is it's interesting, it's informative.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. He's
whereas
got
a
a
lot of stuff that's
lot of
coming.
good information that
Oh
he.
yeah, like a lot of the stuff that's coming in as of late is just like, and I'm just being honest, it's just a lot of crap. But they don't violate the rules, so I can't, so I let it go. But it's not like, but his stuff is actually interesting.
Right.
You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
he's a very smart guy, very
Yeah,
hardworking, and very strict about how he analyzes things and
yeah, yeah.
doesn't jump to conclusions on a lot of stuff, and is very honest about where he's speculating or where he says I think this is likely, I think this is unlikely. That's he's very clear about that, which facilitates discussion, in my opinion, as opposed to people who say no, this is how it is. So
Yeah, then you can't, right? You can't get it.
right. So when it like in the instance of like the technical influence of Spanish fencing on Filipino martial arts, I don't want to say there wasn't any or it was just this.
Mm,
I would rather say uh, it's unlikely, or this is likely, or this could have been, like with the sword and dagger. We don't have an answer, so here's some possibilities. Here's some different answers.
mm,
Here's why this might be more or less likely than this other thing. Um, the same thing with the numbering of the angles. Here's, oh, it came from Spanish. Well, not necessarily. It could have come from somewhere else. It could have come from the Americans, because America was there for 45 years. Um, Spain was there for much longer, but the amount of time that they were numbering the cuts of their saber strikes was really small. So it's comparable, and they also could have gotten numbering from elsewhere. So it's things like that where you say, it could be this, it could be that, and so if you say no, things were definitely like this, it was definitely this and definitely that, it doesn't just shut down discussion, it also shuts down lines of research. So like specifically when it comes to Filipino martial arts, I can look at a lot of the Spanish documentation, historical documentation, Portuguese as well. Um, I don't read Chinese, and I don't have access to any historical Chinese documentation.
mm,
Or any other, like Chinese is just an example, is a prominent example because they've got a lot of records. So there could be information in various other places that contribute to these things that we don't know about unless somebody goes to look.
like somebody that reads, like actually digs them up and has access
Right,
to them,
right.
and
And so it's really interesting with Chinese because like there's a HEMA equivalent for Chinese martial arts, right? They've got historical treatises with the different Chinese weapons, that aren't practiced in that way anymore. So there are people that are doing what's happening in HEMA, where they're going back and looking at um, these old treatises where they talk about fencing with a Chinese sword,
mm,
and bringing that up. So that might uncover more information about the Philippines or things that happen in the Philippines as they do historical research. And the same kind of thing is happening with African martial arts. And it's there's a lot that's in common between uh, all these different types of historical research into martial arts, and they kind of help each other. And if you say, no, this is the way it was, and it wasn't like this, that kind of shuts down people looking into that. And if you leave the possibility open, you go, hey, there may have been influence from China, there may have been influence from India, there may have been influence from Japan, then people can go, well, I wonder, because I read Chinese, I read old Chinese, I can go have
Yeah.
access to these things, and they can find more information that helps everyone.
I mean, with all the trade, I mean, going on back then, you know what I mean?
Right,
Going through there. I mean, there's culturally speaking, right?
right.
So, yeah, for sure, for sure. Well, we got to get on to Tim. So, yeah. So when you talk to him next, tell him like, and you use my, by all means, tell him what I said, like, bring you both on.
Yeah, I'll let them know.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, I really appreciate you coming on here, man. I knew because I know I was always wanted to ask you, but I was hesitant because I know you don't like coming on and being there. But I'm thinking, like, God,
Yeah.
people need to hear from you.
Yeah, I don't like talking about myself too much. So if we have a topic to talk about like this, then
Yeah.
I'll go on and talk for hours and hours and hours about this
All right.
stuff.
Well, from now on, I'm going to bring you back on, but we're just not going to talk about you. So just.
Good. Yeah, I'm perfectly fine with that.
All right, Tim. Well, thank you so much, and please let me know what Tim says.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, you take care.
You too. Thank you.
Bye. That was excellent. God, that guy's a wealth of information. But at any rate, who is next? Who is next? Next week on Marshall Man, Mark Stewart, JKD. However, though, not the Anasana lineage. We're going to be looking at, and the name is escaping me now. Ted Wong lineage. Ted Wong lineage. Yeah. So we're going to be covering that. And tomorrow night, kind of a last minute thing, covering Block Party. Steve Discillo. He's doing his yearly block party, and I think he's got 4 or 5 people teaching over the weekend. And so, yeah, we're going to cover that on there. So, yeah, if you're in California, sounds like a good time. All right, folks. We'll see you. Well, maybe I'll see you tomorrow night. If not, next Wednesday. Or Monday could be interesting enough. Monday, having Marner Nice. I don't want to give it away because it's not confirmed yet. But at any rate, this guy's gonna be talking about the early days. Should be pretty interesting. Matter of fact, I'm just looking here right now because he sent a message before. Could be Monday. So, but like always, you guys will see it posted in FMA discussion. So, yeah, no worries there. All right, folks, take care.